Alright guys, welcome back to the start of another project. So in this project I decided to skip the milling phase for you guys and just head into the pre-glued up panels. So we're starting off with these panels by making sure they are nice and flat before I cut any joinery on them. Now the best way to do this, if you don't have a big jointer and planer and all that stuff, is a nice low angle jack. So I'm watching the grain directions, constantly checking this piece, making sure it's staying nice and flat before we head towards our joinery. So this bookcase is going to be mainly built up of hand-cut joinery. So everything from dovetails on the top to through mortise and tenon on holding the shelves, and well, actually that's it. There's not a whole lot of fancy joinery. It's just kind of a lot of practice. So the main reason I want to do this was exactly that. I just need to practice my hand-cut joinery. And so up until now, a lot of the stuff that I've been doing is small boxes, that small ash cabinet I built a few weeks ago. It's all fairly small stuff, so I wanted to take a shot at making something a little bit bigger. One thing I will note at the beginning of this video, the consistency of the shop is going to change quite a bit. This project has been happening over almost 2 months now, and a lot of things were constantly moving around. So if you notice machinery in the background is moving around, just ignore it and just know that I have finally settled on something. And so now we get to move on to the fun part. Handcut dovetails are by far my favorite thing to do right now. Absolutely nothing beats just turning off all the power tools and slowly working away. And so I kind of regretted this near the end, but I'll explain that in a later video, but I cut that small rabbet on the back side of the dovetails. The idea, this was taught to me by Jonathan Katz-Moses in his video, and it's a really good idea for alignment when you're starting off with like boxes or small objects, but again, I'll explain it later on once we hit that point. And so here I'm just going through my normal dovetail steps, and you'll notice a new dovetail saw. This thing is the Veritas dovetail saw with the, I think it's the coarse teeth, and so this thing is an absolute beast for cutting dovetails. I'm still learning how to use a back saw rather than a Japanese pull saw, so that's a little complicated, but overall I definitely prefer it over the Japanese style saws. And so to start off the tails, I use the guide, the little Veritas magnetic guide, to start and make sure I get my blade nice and straight, and then I cut about 1/8 of an inch, which is just enough to then take the guide off and cut the rest freehand. So I'm definitely taking a little bit more practice on it, but it is definitely getting there. And then, as usual, just cleaning up the little bit of waste with the coping saw. Now, again, this is something I need a lot more practice with. I'm still leaving quite a bit of waste when I do this, but again, I've seen a lot of pro woodworkers, a lot of people that are really good at hand-cut dovetails, and I mean, the amount of waste they leave just depends on the day, I guess. So, something that takes a little bit of practice, but eventually is a skill I'm hoping to get pretty good at. And so the last step on the tails is to knock out that little bit of waste. So I'm working with a nice narrow chisel here and just slowly working my way down. And you can see I'm using these magnetic guides to help pare down the sides and keep them at that precise angle. And then going to, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he's a master at dovetails. And so I saw that he used this Scotch tape or blue tape, green tape, whatever you want to call it, trick. And this makes marking out the pins so much easier. It's so much easier to see than a small line, and I definitely prefer it to how I've done it in the past. So all I'm doing here is using this porter cable jig to help line everything up. Again, this is something that you're going to see disappear later on in the video and get replaced, but for now it was put to good use for this setup. And so you can see here, once I mark it out the lines and then I peel off the extra tape, you can see just how well it's laid out. Now, one thing I will say is that cutting the pins is quite a bit harder, actually. The guides the angle isn't perfect when I do it all with the chisels and that on the tails. So I kind of have to use the guide to just kind of start and leave quite a bit of space so that I can then work my way back to the proper fitting pins slowly but surely. And I mean, I don't even know how many times I sharpened during this whole project, but I mean, sitting down, sharpening the chisels, doing all that, is probably about my favorite time in the shop. You don't get a whole lot of times where you just can do a kind of a mindless task and just not, I don't know, not have to worry about what you're doing and just sit there and think. And sharpening the chisels is definitely one of those times where you can just shut your mind down and just think about the project. And so again, excuse my chisel work. I'm still pretty new to it, still getting my hands focused and balanced and all that. I still find that quite challenging. So you'll notice it's a little bit shaky and a little bit messy, but I am doing my best. I promise you that. Also, these Veritas PMV11 chisels are absolutely amazing. They were bloody expensive, but worth absolutely every penny after I got into actually using them. And so you can see just how much material I left behind with the saw. So the first step here is just to get the baseline nice and square to the side. Now I've got this little square that I use to check just the baseline of the pin board. And off camera I went through and cleaned up all the pins to get them to their fitting size, because that's a little bit of a nightmare to try and record. So I saved you guys watching me stand there with the file for hours on end. And so you can see I got both sides fitted up with the pins, and everything is starting to come together. This was probably the most exciting part of this project, is just getting these first bits of joinery in, peeling off this leftover green tape, and just kind of seeing what I was at for now. So we're moving on to the rest of the joinery now, which is the through mortise and tenons that'll be holding the upper shelf and the bottom shelf. And so I decided to go through more tenons because I just think that they look kind of interesting. And it's this type of joinery I want to practice with a little bit more. I've gotten a decent amount of practice with Handcut Dovetails, but mortise and tenon is one that I definitely need a lot more practice with. So just kind of laying out the position on the panel. And that was definitely the most challenging part of this project, was trying to figure out how to locate those mortise and tenon, or the mortises, on these big panels where I couldn't really measure in accurately. And so I just had to trust that I milled all the panels the exact same way to the same widths, and everything went off referential measurements, and in the end it all worked out pretty much perfectly. So it's definitely what I'm going to have to work on I'm definitely going to have to work on my alignment and all that in the future, but it is definitely a point of taking the time to stop and think about what you're trying to do rather than just rushing forward. So slowly knocking through these mortise soles. Again, I'd like to get some mortise chisels in the future, but for now I'm just using my Veritas PMV11 chisels, which I was really worried about damaging them. I'm not gonna lie, I don't quite know how tough they really are yet, and so I took it nice and slow, peeling back little piece by little piece at a time, and just treating these chisels super delicately. So it took a little while, but eventually I was able to get through and get nice square mortises. And so I checked the fit by fitting through this half-inch Veritas setup block, which is 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, which let me know that they were perfectly square. And then I could go on to setting up the top and bottom shelf. So on both sides have this little rabbet on the top and bottom side of the shelf, just to make it so you can hide the mortises a little bit better on the inside of the case. And so it's a very exact same process as the dovetails, is just using the rabbet to just make your joinery a little bit more clean. So then I could go through, measure and mark out, and then it was on to cutting the tenons. Now again, I am really new to this back saw, and trying to get it to work properly is been quite difficult. But I just cut down the straight lines, again starting with the guide, and then cleared out the waste with the coping saw. And you can see again, I left quite a bit of extra space so that I would be, same as with the pin board, I wanted to make sure that I could clean up the pins, or the tenons, and get everything nicely fitted without having to cut in too deep or anything like that. You can see on this first one, it actually came together pretty well. There's a little bit of cupping in my outside panels, which is a little bit noticeable in the final piece, but not overall, it's nothing too drastic that I am too freaked out about. But I mean, that is the first stage of the cabinets, so overall it's pretty much done. All the complicated parts are, everything's in place, all the joinery that holds the case together is completed. And so everything on the bottom shelf was the exact same as the top shelf, and so I didn't want to go through showing you the whole process again, because it was the exact same thing. But now we get the super satisfying part of putting the whole thing together. Now, the cool thing about this kind of joinery is just the idea that you could put this whole thing together really without glue. The dovetails will hold themselves together, and if you did wedged mortise and tenons, that would be enough pressure to hold everything together pretty much permanently. So that was, I don't know, this was kind of the best moment, is just seeing the case finally coming together.